to the third of our video series, the Middle Colonies and the Southern Colonies. Don't forget to fill out your outlines as we go along. You are going to make sure that you have them by Monday, please. So if we look at the Middle Colonies about 1685, we have New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Both New Jersey and Delaware are part of Pennsylvania in the grant that was given to William Penn. New York itself had been established in 1609 as a Dutch colony by the Dutch West India Company, and they wanted an economic rival to England and Spain in the Americas. Its population throughout its early history is very small, but it's very diverse. It includes Finnish, Swedish, German, African, and Dutch citizens, all of which are free, including the Africans. In 1664, the English fleet captured the colony with very little resistance. It wasn't very unexpected at the time, and then they rename it New York quickly thereafter. You can see that the Dutch settlements were pretty well surrounded by the British settlements, so they weren't, the takeover wasn't very unexpected by them. New York is given to the Duke of York, and this includes New Jersey, Delaware, and Maine, and it's personal property of James, who is the cousin to the King of England. The inhabitants of New York will have no political voice except at the local level. Everything goes through the Duke himself, and James himself has little to gain from this, but it certainly does get him quite a bit of notoriety. Pennsylvania, we know, was settled by the Quakers, and they believe in what's called inner light. They reject the original sin and predestination beliefs of other religions, especially those of Catholics and Puritans who had settled around them. They believed each person could communicate directly with God, and that everyone was equal in the eyes of God and could be saved, but it did require them to convert to Quakerism itself. Penn's settlement of Pennsylvania becomes labeled the Holy Experiment. He wanted to establish a religious sanctuary in the New World where people could come and practice their beliefs without fear of any kind of repercussions. He promoted religious toleration throughout the colony and wanted to protect the rights of those who had no property, especially in England. This appealed to the Welsh, English, German, and Irish immigrants, as they traditionally were much more impoverished and had very little ability to move up the social and economic ladders in Europe itself. William Penn was noted for his fair treatment of Native Americans and had a very good relationship with them. Pennsylvania itself was very ethnically, nationally, and religiously diverse, and because of this, intercolonial disputes were pretty common, but they still continued to prosper despite these disputes. In 1701, Penn granted self-rule to the colonists, and they developed their own system of democracy there. He also granted Delaware and New Jersey their independence at this time as well. You can see this population growth chart shows that the northern port cities of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia grew quite rapidly in this first 125 years of settlement. And though Charlestown, the only southern port city, does grow quite a bit, it certainly doesn't grow as significantly as the other three. The lower south is the region that has North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Initially, North Carolina and South Carolina are part of one colony called Carolina, and will later separate into two. Carolina is a farming community. It relies on slave labor in agriculture, and therefore it is very similar to the Chesapeake colonies in those respects, but it's very different because there's much less diversity of settlers. Much more diversity of settlers and the backgrounds of those people. And the environment itself is much, much different. It's much more hot and humid. The temperatures are much much, much warmer. The soil is much more fertile and wet, and they have a very different growing cycle there. There is no solid South as we see it by the Civil War. At this time, we still have the Southern and the Chesapeake regions, which will later start to acknowledge just as the South itself. The proprietors of the Carolinas were granted the charter in 1663. There's 8 of them total, and they were inspired by John Locke, who was a political theologist of the time, and he really sets forth a lot of ideas that the nation will found itself on. And the colony of the Carolinas is going to be referred to as a political utopia because it is developed for the express purpose of experimenting with democracy. It creates a government that's led by the wealthy lawmakers, but it does provide for veto power by average citizens. They had quite a bit of difficulty recruiting settlers in the first years, but they do manage to overcome that early on. A little bit later into its history, the political and social tone of the Carolinas is going to change. English planters from the Caribbean island of Barbados are going to be recruited into Charlestown, especially for the purpose of the slave trade. And with them, they're going to bring their much more strict and cruel methods of dealing with slaves and slave codes themselves and introduce those into the Carolinas. They demanded greater self-government within the Carolinas, and this leads to political strife within the colony itself, which ends up dividing it into the northern and southern portions that we know today. So you can see down in the far right corner here, the island of Barbados, and then Charlestown, and that's where those Barbadians make their journey from. Over here to the somewhat period picture of the Charlestown seaport. The main crops of these southern colonies are indigo and rice. There is some tobacco grown, but indigo and rice are much, much more common. And then later on, sugar. But rice is the lower left-hand picture there. It grows really well in moist environments, which the South definitely has. And you can see by looking at the green line on the graph that by 1770, 1780, America and the Carolinas are producing about 85 or more million pounds of rice, which is quite significant. And though some of it is shipped to Asia, a lot of it does remain in the colonies. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you see the beautiful flowering plant, which is indigo. It's the only known natural blue dye or indigo dye for clothing that lasts very long. It's very expensive to produce. It's a very temperamental crop. It's prone to bugs. So it's really difficult and it's very, very expensive to grow. And this is going to produce a lot of wealth for this area because even though the red line on the graph doesn't make it seem like a lot is being produced, 5 to 10 million pounds of indigo is quite a bit and much more than many other areas can produce. Okay, so if we're looking at this map about 1740, which is a little bit later, but Georgia isn't added to the colonies until the middle part of the 18th century. You can see the red lines are the existing boundary lines as of 1740. Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey in the upper part of the map there, those are starting to take shape into the colonies as we know them today. Carolina and Georgia extend much further than they do today, as does South Carolina, but they are starting to shape into what we know them today as. The founding of Georgia takes place, like I said, much later, 1732, by James Oglethorpe, and he wanted this to be a strategic buffer between the economically rich area of the Carolinas and Spanish Florida. Oglethorpe offers Georgia as a settlement for the indebted, poor, imprisoned people in England, and so this draws a very different type of population than the other colonies did. By 1751, the small colony had grown quite a bit, and they had larger plantations, all of which relied on slave labor to operate. The majority of colonies in the New World are what are called proprietary colonies. These are colonies that are created by royal charter, meaning that the king issued a charter to individual businesses or individuals themselves to set up and operate the colonies. Some of the charters granted individual lands to people, and those would be significant lands. So these are Maryland, Carolina, New York, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. By about 1763, this is what the map of colonial America will look like. The states are starting to take shape as we know them today, but you can see in the western half there's a long red line. This is the proclamation line of 1763. We're going to come back to this, but this is essentially a line that prevents settlement, theoretically will prevent settlement beyond that to the west. Conclusions: all of the colonies faced early on struggles to survive, but that really depended on the colony itself and who had set it up and how prepared they were. Out of the development of each colony separately grew distinct regional differences that only intensified and persisted throughout the early colonial period. And it's not going to be until the early revolutionary, late revolutionary period that Americans will even see themselves as a nation separate from Britain. In closing, I hope that you guys got all the material that you needed. If you have any questions, don't be afraid to ask me in class or email me, text me, use Remind. If you'd like to answer the questions that appear on the screen, feel free to do so. Just write them on a slip of paper and attach them to this, or you can write them on the back of the paper, and these will be counted as a little bit of extra credit for you. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help make these better, and I appreciate you guys taking time out of your day to do your homework and expand your knowledge just a little bit more. Have a great night.